I'm going to focus in on one very particular aspect. And I truly believe, and we talk about this with our clients, that preparedness really is about anticipating and addressing the need for information. When you boil everything down, and I say that having responded to several kinds of disasters. So it really is irrespective of whatever kind of disaster we're talking about. There is clearly an expectation from those that may be affected that the organization is going to be able to provide information. And what do they want to know? Well, obviously, not just what happened, but more importantly, where is my loved one? Is he or she okay? And where is she or he? So it really does boil down to those very basic questions. And your planning and your final result of any good plan should be your information flow is the way it should be so that you're going to be able to address those questions. And if that's not the case, there are going to be some repercussions. Because we know that this anticipation is going to occur, you can even pre-identify who are the people that are going to pick up the phone, as Joe mentioned, and make those inquiries. Well, certainly friends and family of your employees or your visitors or your subcontractors that may be on premise. Those are always a bit of an additional challenge. You may be able to account for employees on site, but maybe not so easily to determine which contractors, which visitors happen to be present at the time of the event. Certainly, media are going to have questions. You're going to have other employees, perhaps not from that facility, but elsewhere in your company. You may even have shareholders. So the point being, the number and the extent of the need for information and the overriding volume of inquiry might very well surprise you. We talk about, in working with our airline clients, just to give you an example, one of the best documented results was about 10 years ago. Alaska Airlines had a crash off the coast of California. 88 souls on board. Anybody want to guess how many phone calls they documented they received in 4 hours? How many? 100,000? That's a really good guess. 120,000. 88 people. So it's not so hard to imagine that, you've got your immediate family that knows you work for this company and it's all over the news that there's been an explosion. You don't think they're going to pick up the phone and call? And so how do we plan for that? Well, one way we can do that, you might want to consider, is literally putting something on your phone system that allows for indication that something has occurred. You've activated your emergency plan, and you kind of start to deal with deferring different kinds of phone calls, knowing that friends and family are going to call, knowing that media will call, or someone is calling about something unrelated entirely to the emergency. So that's one way to put something in place in a planful way. Perhaps employees are told to refer to the intranet. In other words, employees will get to you, stay tuned, stay put, and we're going to communicate through the intranet as opposed to the phone system, which will become overloaded very quickly. The other thing that we can say with some certainty is that this expectation of information, it's not just US, it's not just American citizens. We've had the opportunity to see this play out in other parts of the world. So there is a universality to this topic, if you will. And so people want this timely, accurate information and delivered in a compassionate way, especially when this is going to be difficult message or bad news to deliver. We'll talk about that after lunch, how to notify a family member that perhaps one of your employees has been involved and not survived the explosion or fire, whatever the event might be. So going back to the expectation, it's not just what happened, but we need to get to the very specifics. if all you have to do is put yourself in someone's shoes. Is it enough to know that 13 people became fatalities as part of this event and 310 survived? Until you tell me which category my loved one fits in, you have told me nothing. And that is the expectation. And like I say, this is pretty much basic and common sense that everybody, I think, would feel that way if put in that position. I think the small world reference is this notion that, yes, we have differences, but more, we have very much a likeness, and that's worldwide. People are people, and it doesn't matter that you speak a different language or you have different religious beliefs. We had some experience in the past where we made some erroneous assumptions based on a very different culture, very different religion, that the people that were involved from, there was a mix of US, Canadian, and a different culture involved in a plane crash, particular plane crash. And we made an erroneous assumption that those families that were from overseas would probably not have the same expectations or the same requests. We were very mistaken by that. So we don't want to make those assumptions. And what we have found to be effective in terms of looking at cultural, language diversity, or religious diversity is you don't have to be an expert on any of that. All you need to do is to remember to ask someone, what is important to you? What are your religious beliefs? How can we be supportive and helpful? I don't know much about your culture or religion. You know, please tell me some more about that so I can understand. It's a very effective way to demonstrate that you're interested, that you care, and that, again, you don't have to be an expert on some of this stuff. The family's need for information is universal, and I will also say, we'll talk about this a little bit later today, particularly when mass casualty events end up being events in which we have, just as we have serious destruction of a building or an airplane, unfortunately similar destruction occurs with the human body. And so the kinds of challenges that families will face losing a loved one or you losing an employee in this manner is very different from somebody who has a sudden heart attack at work even, or someone who dies naturally, and we're going to talk about that. So think about, you've all heard the stages of grief, and the first one is shock and denial. We can tell you with great emphasis that when you lose a loved one very suddenly, and in some cases rather horrifically, your denial is that much stronger and that much longer. In other words, that sense of this can't be happening persists for a very, very long time. And we'll talk about that a bit this afternoon as well. We've certainly seen this. You know, Joe mentioned that, 10 years ago, business continuity was all about IT. We're just beginning to see more companies and organizations take the approach that, hey, maybe we do need to look more about our people and our employee issues and planning. Again, the plan, if you look at the people aspects, external and internal communication strategies are really going to be the linchpin of making sure that information is flowing the way it should. And so that you have the ability to provide information to those sectors that expect it. We've talked about this notion that volume and capacity of your internal systems is going to be questioned or come into play. There's some things on the market that maybe some of you have already purchased that allows you to manage information in the event of some kind of disaster. It really does need to be web-based because, as you know, you will have multiple personnel, multiple locations, and there needs to be a tool to somehow share that information in real time. I won't even go into the story of what we did in our very first disaster response with an Access database and a whole lot of paper. It wasn't pretty. So we've come a long way in refining our information management tools. Thank goodness. I think everybody would agree that you have to have that centralized location where information comes in and out of. So whether you call that your command center, your emergency operations center, whatever you call it, the fact is without that, information is going to get distorted. You're going to have misalignment with what parts of the company are saying, and unless you have that centralized, that is going to be a huge problem. And going back to the title of that one, truly, truly, information management in any emergency, disaster, crisis, whatever you want to call it, that will be your greatest challenge. There are very few absolutes. I truly believe this is one of them. Some principles that we have seen anyway, preparedness is about reputation management, let's face it. You as an organization or company that experiences some kind of workplace disaster are going to be scrutinized, not just from the public at large, from the media, but by your own internal employees. So you need to be prepared for what are some of those different audiences going to expect of you. So what we've said is look at what kind of information they're going to ask for. We know this ahead of time, and you can plan for it accordingly. People are more important than procedures. That's kind of an obvious one. What about perception as reality? That's an interesting one, and what we have found is that you can spend a whole lot of money having a state-of-the-art command center, and maybe you've spent a ton of money on your IT redundancy and systems, but if you can't answer basic questions about what's happened to your employees, what are you doing for your employees, the perception of you as a company is not going to be positive. So you have to realize that that perception piece really is the most important. Despite what you might be doing behind the scenes, it's how people perceive the company as responding is what counts. So what do we know about information management, and how can we look at that as best practices? First of all, we've talked about the understanding expectations. Certainly, the expectation is that the company has a plan. Joe mentioned 9/11 earlier, and we did have a fairly significant role in responding to that event. We staffed a call center for the Department of Justice. Staffed that call center about 3 months round the clock. And it was, in a word, heartbreaking that the people who called this toll-free number, and essentially those were friends and family members of people that worked in the 2 Trade Center towers, their first question was, is my loved one on the list? What list? I mean, very few employers in the towers had even a plan, a list that they could account for their employees. But think about it. If something happens to someone you care about during a workday, you do have an expectation that that organization is going to be able to tell you what has happened to them. And we need to be aware of that in terms of our planning. Certainly, victim families want to be apprised before the media gets the story. Now, that's increasingly difficult. But to the extent that you can account for people and make those calls, make those connections, that's really important. Not to find out about it through a tweet or through Facebook or on the news. We know the media is going to have their own questions. They're looking at the organization in terms of not only what happened, but what are you doing to respond to it? So again, what is that perception of you as a company? Are you prepared? Are you organized? Are you caring and compassionate based on some of your actions? And then we've talked about the family perception and questions involved. How about evaluating a plan? We've talked about this a little bit. Certainly your media folks, your public relations folks probably have a communication plan that may or may not even be within your overall plan. It might even be a separate kind of document. But they are going to focus on, their messaging will be on, again, the organization has a plan, we're responsive, here's what we know, here's what we're going to do next. And those should be the kind of messages that are conveyed. Family members and even employees at a certain point are basically going to ask, what's the organization going to do for me? Or what is this aftermath? What does this look like? And more importantly, what does it mean for me individually? So one thing you might want to do, based on what we've talked about today, is look at these different audiences and the kinds of information that they're going to expect the organization to provide, and look at your resources. See where your gaps are. Because these are, as I said, pretty clearly givens. If you have, and the larger the scale of the crisis, the more likely this is going to be one of your great challenges. So what are your options? You can do nothing. Joe talked about what you do to manage risk. You can handle internally and look at what you have and make sure that you've maybe added resources or staffing. You can outsource some of this, and then kind of the final model that we've seen is to kind of on a hybrid level partner with certain things that you may be lacking internally that you believe maybe is best procured from an outside provider. So those are your basic options. The point being, we really do know enough about this information management piece that I think it's important to, again, remember as we do our planning. If you can develop and practice a plan that clearly demonstrates that you've anticipated these informational requests and actually demands, that will go a long way in ensuring some, I don't want to use the word success, but an effective response to a disaster has to include this. There are, quite frankly, expectations of every employer, and nowhere was that more demonstrated on 9/11. In some ways, it's been a bit disappointing that more business and industry, really, nationwide, didn't take that as a wake-up call. Certainly there are organizations out there that have really taken this and taken it to a very high level so that that preparedness is in place. But in some cases, that really hasn't taken place. But I guarantee you, if something happened, and the larger your company or facility, the more difficult it is. But if you haven't thought about that, please take that back to your individual organizations, because I guarantee you, something happens during the workday, you have employees on site, those family members are going to pick up the phone and expect you to be able to tell them what has happened to their loved one. And as Jill mentioned, there really is no substitute. You know, I always think about, why do we do those fire drills in 2nd, 3rd grade, our elementary school days? We did it for a reason, that mental rehearsal. And so the actual evacuation action is more important than just talking about, here's how you evacuate the building. There really is value in actually performing that action, and there really is no substitute for that.